Hello and welcome to Psych Boost. This video is going to be a little bit different than the usual ones, because in this video we're going to be comparing approach to approach. Comparing approaches is certainly a question that can be asked in your approaches section of your paper 2, and there are a range of ways that we can compare one approach to another. Here we have the 5 main approaches. We have cognitive psychologists, psychodynamics, humanist, biological psychology, and behaviorists. Now, behaviorists fall under learning theorists along with social learning theory, but there are a number of differences between them. As you can see by the arrows, there are a large number of different combinations of ways to compare one theory to another. Now, I would suggest that maybe you skip ahead or back in this video to the comparisons that you're most confused about, as listening to each comparison individually might be a little repetitive. So we'll start with behaviorists compared to social learning theory. If we understand the differences between behaviorists and social learning theorists, it should make the comparison between social learning theory and any other approach relatively easy. So while social learning theorists and behaviorists agree on many things, one thing they really disagree with is internal mental processes. So behaviorists totally ignore the role of conscious thought, and they say it's unscientific to even consider the notion that there are mental processes going on inside the brain, or that they're actually knowable or open to scientific testing. Social learning theorists, however, though they agree with much of what the behaviorists say, they do suggest there are internal mental processes. The name for them are mediational processes, and they feel they're important in the generation of behaviour in humans. When it comes to disorders and treatments, behaviourists use techniques like flooding for phobias learnt via conditioning, or systematic desensitisation. Behaviourist ideas are part of the development of cognitive behavioural therapy. And social learning theorists will use reward mechanisms like token economies in order to manipulate behaviour. When it comes to the free will determinism debate, behaviourists argue that behaviour is environmentally determined. What you do is down to the stimuluses that you receive, and that results in a response. Social learning theorists, however, suggest a more soft determinist view. While the environment is important, and internal mental mediational processes will go on to determine behaviour, social learning theorists suggest there is a role for choice. When it comes to scientific methodology, behaviourists are seen as quite scientific. They focus solely on the experimental method, and they only state what can be objectively measured, so stimuli and response mechanisms. Because of this, they completely ignore internal mental processes. Social learning theorists are on shakier scientific ground, because they suggest internal mental processes should be considered, but it's very difficult to objectively measure these processes. When it comes to reductionists, behaviorists are very environmentally reductionist. In fact, the only approach that is more reductionist, we might argue, is the biological approach. In this environmental reductionist, it completely ignores mental processes and socio-cultural explanations. Social learning theorists, though, are much less reductionist. They include mental factors and ideas about the emotional interactions with other humans, but they do ignore factors that influence behaviour, such as biological factors. When it comes to childhood development, behaviours suggest that development is based entirely on environmentally conditioned behaviours. These behaviours are learnt by association, reinforcement and punishment. But social learning theorists suggest that behaviours are also learnt vicariously through social interaction. When it comes down to nature-nurture, behaviourists are completely nurture. There's no role for instincts, as we are born as blank slates, and were shaped solely by environmental experiences. When it comes to social learning theory, again, nature, however, also suggests we're shaped by our observation of other people's experience. And when it comes to the idiographic nomothetic debate, behaviourists are nomothetic completely. They rely on the use of large scales, mostly animal experiments, to provide their general laws of behaviour, but they then apply those laws of behaviour onto humans. Social learning theorists, again, nomothetic. They rely on the use of large experimental methods in determining general laws of behaviour, such as Bandora's study with the Bobo doll. Next up, we have behaviourists compared to cognitive psychologists. So, when it comes to internal mental processes, behaviourists and cognitive psychologists are completely the opposite. Behaviourists completely ignore the role of conscious thought. They say it's unscientific to include it in theories, whereas cognitive psychologists' entire focus is on internal mental processes. They construct models that suggest thoughts follow predictable systems, and they then go on to test these models and use results of the tests to infer the nature of these internal mental processes. Next up, disorders and treatments. One example of a treatment by behaviourists is flooding. This use of phobias that are learned via classical conditioning, or also behaviourists as part of the development of CBT, as is cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology, however, suggests that disorders are due to maladaptive thought processes, and is treated through cognitive behavioural therapy, such as Ellis's ABC model. Have a look at the psychopathology unit for a more in-depth look at different disorders and treatments of these two approaches. The free will determinism debate. Behaviourists suggest that behaviour is entirely environmentally determined, a basis of stimulus resulting in a response. Whereas cognitive psychologists suggest soft determinism, the idea that people's thoughts are affected by previous experience. People build schema as a result of previous experience and then act off those schemas. But it's also thought by cognitive psychologists that conscious thought can override previous schemas, so free will does have a role. When it comes to scientific methodology, behaviorists use the experimental method, do large pieces of research studying objectively measurable stimulus-response mechanisms. There's an argument that they're very scientific because they ignore inobservable internal mental processes. Cognitive psychologists also use experimentation. Once they get results from these experiments, they use inferences to uncover what they think is the internal mental process behind the behaviour. Could be argued, though, that these inferences are unscientific. Maybe the cognitive psychologists go beyond the evidence. Reductionism. Behaviorists, it's argued, are entirely environmentally reductionist. They ignore internal mental processes and socio-cultural explanations and biological factors. For cognitive psychologists, we could use the term machine reductionism. Cognitive psychologists see the brain as just like a computer, with the mind a series of processes that run on the computer, like software. We might want to argue that the mind is much more complex than that. When it comes to childhood development, behaviorist psychologists think that we are entirely environmentally conditioned. This is through the process of association, reinforcement, and punishment. Cognitive psychologists also think we are environmentally conditioned. We develop by acquiring schema from our experiences about the world, and then we use those to interpret the world around us as kind of cognitive shortcuts. When it comes to the nature-nurture debate, behaviorists are entirely nurture. There's no role for instincts, there's no role for bio, as we're born blank slates. We're shaped by the environment around us. When it comes to cognitive psychologists, there's argued there's an interaction of brain structure, which is a result of biology, and also learned experiences. These learned experiences, like schema, influence the functioning of our internal mental systems. When it comes to the idiographic and nomothetic argument, the behaviorists are down the nomothetic line. They use large, mostly animal experiments to provide some general laws of behaviour, and then they go on to apply this to human behaviour. Now, cognitive psychologists are mainly nomothetic. They'll mainly use large experiments to test their mental models. However, they'll also use case studies, so perhaps people with interesting brain damage, and make inference based on that brain damage about the structure of mental processes. Next up, we have behaviorists versus psychodynamics. So, when it comes to internal mental processes, behaviorists completely ignore the role of conscious thought. They say it's just unscientific to assume something that can't be directly observed and tested. However, psychodynamics see a really large role for unconscious mental processes. Unconscious mental processes for psychodynamic are dominated by the id, the ego, and the superego. And this suggests that the internal mental processes of defense mechanisms is a large part of how we function. When it comes to disorders and treatments, behaviorists prefer techniques such as flooding, which attempt to adapt behaviour that was learnt by conditioning. This forms part of the CBT therapy. Psychodynamics, however, use psychotherapy as a treatment. They see disorders as due to pathological childhood development, and they use the process of introspection, so looking in at your own thoughts, as part of psychotherapy. When it comes to the free will determinism debate, behaviourists see that behaviour is environmentally determined. Behaviour is a result of stimulus, which automatically leads to a particular response. There's no role for free will. Psychodynamics, however, see behaviour as psychically determined. Our behaviour is a result of internal mental processes, internal mental unconscious processes that lead us to behave in certain ways, such as defense mechanisms. Next up, let's talk about scientific methodology. Now, the behaviourists be seen as very scientific. They focus on the experimental method and they try to study objectively measurable stimuli and response mechanisms. Anything that can't be studied objectively, like internal mental processes, are completely ignored. Psychodynamics, on the other hand, are seen broadly as very unscientific. It tends to be based heavily on the use of case studies, which then perhaps inappropriately are used to make general laws of behaviour, and also the use of introspection, which many would argue is quite biased. As well as this, many of the concepts used by psychodynamic psychologists are fundamentally untestable. When it comes to reductionism, behaviourists are seen as environmental reductionist. It ignores social cultural explanations or biological factors. Psychodynamics is argued as reductionist because it sees behaviour as primarily due to drives. However, it does also include aspects of thought processes and learning, so it wouldn't be seen as reductionist in the same way that behaviourist and biological psychologists would be. When it comes to childhood development, behaviourists see us as environmentally conditioned via the process of association, and also reinforcement and punishment. When it comes to psychodynamics, psychodynamic theorists see childhood experience as vital in the later development of adult emotional disorders. Getting stuck at any of the psychosexual stages will produce pathologies. When it comes to the nature-nurture debate, Behaviorists are entirely down the nurture route. There's no role for instincts, and there's no role for biological factors, as we're born blank slates, to then be shaped entirely by the environment. Psychodynamics take a more balanced view. They see there's a role both for innate drives due to our biology, but also the role of childhood experience come together and shape you. When it comes to idiographic versus nomothetic argument, behaviorists are very nomothetic. They'll use large-scale animal experiments. They'll use the results of these experiments to produce general laws for human behaviour. The psychodynamic approach would be argued to be very much idiographic due to their heavy use of the case study, using in-depth information gained from an individual in order to find out about psychology. But psychodynamics' attempt to then generalise these findings as general laws of human behaviour could be seen in some ways as nomothetic. So next up we have the comparison between behaviorists and humanistic psychologists. So when it comes to internal mental processes, the behaviorists will ignore the role of conscious thought. They suggest it's completely unscientific to consider mental processes because they can't be directly measured. Humanistic psychologists, however, don't really care about the scientific process. They consider internal mental processes to be the conscious mind, and that it's in control of all actions and has complete free will to make any decision. When it comes to disorders and treatments, behaviorists use techniques such as flooding to treat disorders such as phobias, which they argue is learnt via conditioning. Behaviorist psychology is also part of the development of CBT. Humanistic psychologists, however, they focus not on disorders, but on what it is to be a healthy human, so not the pathology. In order to do this, they focus on the role of unconditional positive regard. To become healthy, they focus on the role of such things as giving unconditional positive regard. When it comes to the free will determinism debate, behaviorists say that behaviour is completely environmentally determined. Behaviour is the result of a stimulus leading to a response. However, humanistic psychologists are fully down the free will debate, and they're the only approach to do this. They say humans have got complete ability to express free will through their conscious decision making. When it comes to the scientific methodology, behaviorists are very scientific. They'll follow the experimental method carefully, and they'll only study objectively measurable stimulus-response mechanisms. They'll ignore any internal mental process or anything that can't be directly scientifically measured. Humanistic psychologists, on the other hand, they just completely reject the scientific approach. They don't see humans as suitable for scientific study. They suggest that we're just far too complex, with our different layers of biological, psychological, and socio-cultural factors. When it comes to reductionism, behaviorists are environmentally reductionist. They ignore broader mental processes and socio-cultural explanations, and even biological factors when explaining behaviour. They reduce everything down to an environmental stimulus response mechanism. Humanistic psychologists, though, are the ones that are fully holistic. They suggest the only way to understand human behaviour is to consider all aspects, all levels of humanity, from the biological all the way up to the socio-cultural, and they have to be considered together. When it comes to childhood development, though, behaviour suggests that we're environmentally conditioned through processes of association, reinforcement and punishment. The humanistic view on the healthy development of children is that children need unconditional positive regard and need to focus on satisfying their hierarchy of needs in order to reach self-actualization. When it comes to the nature-nurture debate, behaviour is on the nurture side. Behaviour is on the nurture side of the debate. There's no role for instincts or biological factors. We're born as blank slates and entirely shaped by the environment. Humanistic psychologists as well focus on experiences going through life, such as whether we receive unconditional positive regard or not. But being holistic, they also accept there are complex interactions with biological aspects and others. When it comes to the idiographic versus nomothetic argument, behaviourists are very nomothetic. They use large animal experiments that give general laws for human behaviour, whereas humanistic psychologists are very idiographic. They make no attempt to make general laws of human behaviour. Instead, they use studies which look at the subjective experiences of individuals. So next up we have the behaviourist compared to the biological approach. So when it comes to internal mental processes, again, behaviourists completely ignore the role of conscious and unconscious thought as simply unscientific because it can't be directly measured. Biological psychologists, thoughts are due to the complex interaction of neurons in the brain, and thoughts can be understood by looking at cognitive neuroscience. When considering disorders and treatments, behaviour sees psychopathology as due to conditioning. The biological approach, however, sees disorders as due primarily down to the imbalance of neurotransmitters, faulty genes, or damaged brain structure, and they tend to treat disorders with drug treatments. When it comes to the free will determinism debate, behaviourists suggest that behaviour is environmentally determined, so behaviour is due to a stimulus-response mechanism, with no role for free will. Biological psychologists suggest that behaviour is biologically determined. You do what you do due to the interaction of neurotransmitters and genes and brain structure, and again, you have no free will. When it comes to scientific methodology, both behaviorists and biological psychologists are seen as scientific. Behaviorists use experimental method to study objectively measurable stimulus-response mechanisms, and they ignore things that can't be directly observed, such as internal mental processes. Biological psychologists use scientific measuring equipment like fMRI and blood tests in controlled settings in order to ensure objective measurements. So again, quite scientific. When it comes to reductionism, behaviorists are seen as environmentally reductionist. They explain behaviour through simple stimulus-response mechanisms, which ignores mental processes, biological and socio-cultural explanations. On the other hand, biological psychologists are probably seen as the most reductionist. All behaviour for them is explained through the interaction between neurotransmitters. This reduces behaviour down to the point where learnt behaviour is ignored and social cultural factors are ignored. When it comes to childhood development, behaviourist psychologists see childhood development as a result of environmentally conditioned behaviours that are learned via association, reinforcement and punishment. Whereas the biological psychologist will suggest that development is strongly influenced by genetic factors. The inheritance of these are due to evolutionary pressures. When it comes to the nature-nurture debate, they're certainly on opposite sides. The behaviourists are fully nurture. There's no role for instincts or biology, as we're seen as born as blank slates ready to be shaped by the environment. While on the opposite perspective, the biological approach sees us as nature in origin. Behaviour is a result of an interaction of pre-existing neurotransmitters, genes and brain structures, which are in place as soon as we're born. When it comes to the idiographic versus normothetic approach, behaviourists and biological psychologists are fully normothetic. Behaviourists tend to do large animal-based experiments that provide general laws which they then apply to human behaviour. Biological psychologists use large biological studies, and they use this to give general medical and physiological based laws. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviourist approach. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviourist approach. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviourist approach. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviourist approach. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviorist approach. This slide uses approaches previously discussed, so if you'd like to hear me talk through them, just scroll back up to hear either one of them compared to the behaviorist approach. So I hope you enjoyed this PsychBoost video. Please, if you haven't already, click subscribe, and if you enjoyed this video, give me a like. If you have any questions at all, pop them in the comment box and I'll try and get back to you. If you'd like the free resources that come with this course, I put the posters and some other things into this Dropbox link. Until the next video.